All right, guys, welcome into my updated college football playoff scenarios here. We are getting later into the season. We've got the first edition of the college football playoff rankings coming out on Tuesday, and we do have some clarity in some of these conferences, a lot of different scenarios possibly to play out. Taking a look at the ACC, it really is Florida State or bust, and now you can see on the far right side the win-out percentage. That's becoming more and more important to look at. Florida State already 8-0, 53% chance to win out. Likely it's going to be a lot higher than that. You have to, factor in the probability of each game likely being over 60 or 70% chance for Florida State. Very likely going to be 12-0 going to the ACC championship. If they lose the ACC championship, I think they're completely out, even though they would be 12-1, depending on what happens with LSU. If you are a Florida State fan, you want LSU badly to beat Alabama this week. That would be huge because you have that neutral site win. If Florida State loses a regular season game, then wins the ACC, as long as LSU keeps winning, they should be in. But the ACC at this point, you can take a look at Louisville. The reason I'm not paying attention to them, they are 7-1, but they've got a 5% chance to win out. Very low chance in terms of that. All the other teams are officially out. North Carolina, the 2 losses. Miami, the 2 losses. So it looks like the ACC is Florida State or bust. Moving on to the Big 12. Oklahoma and Texas, both with 1 loss. Oklahoma, 33% chance to win out. Texas, a 22% chance to win out. I could see Oklahoma and even Texas losing another game. If that happens, the Big 12 is done. I think the Big 12 right now, based on the conference overall, very likely to have 0 teams that make the playoff. Texas is the one team everyone is kind of looking at and hoping, especially the big TV networks. Could you imagine Texas versus Ohio State, Texas versus Michigan, really Texas versus anyone in the playoff? Quinn Ewers has to get healthy. Texas has some tough games coming up. Kansas State is an underrated team. Texas gets them at home, but look at Kansas State. Analytics love them. They're ranked number 12. They've got a 10% chance to win out. They could crash the Texas-Oklahoma party and possibly make the Big 12 championship if they can beat Texas. Again, Oklahoma still has tough games coming up. They've got a game at the end of the season against TCU. They also have a game against Oklahoma State, the rivalry game on the road. It's going to come down to Texas and Oklahoma. If they both end up with 2 losses, the conference is done. If Oklahoma wins out and beats Texas, I think they're probably in. I don't have their resume in front of me. It's not great, but they would have a win over 2 wins over Texas at that point. We will see. If Texas wins out, undoubtedly they're going to be in because they would avenge their 1 loss, and they have that road win over Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And also at that point, they would have beaten Kansas State at home, and Kansas State might end up ranked. So I think if Texas wins out, they're for sure in. If Oklahoma wins out, they're probably in. It is very likely, in my opinion, that both of those teams end up with 2 losses and we get no teams from the Big 12, but most likely it's going to be Texas that makes the playoff from that conference. Moving on to the Big 10, you do have the Big 3, Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State. Penn State really trending down right now. Obviously, we're watching that round robin. The next game of that round robin is going to be Michigan at Penn State. Michigan very likely to be around 5 or 6 point favorites going into that game, maybe even more, because Penn State is trending down right now, but it is those teams, and especially we're looking at a potential similar scenario to last year where it is undefeated 11-0 Ohio State at undefeated 11-0 Michigan. Michigan going to be the favorite in that game. Let's say Michigan wins that game again. Ohio State is sitting there 11-1. This is when it gets very important if you are a Buckeye fan. You need to be rooting for Notre Dame. You need to be rooting for Penn State. Even if Penn State loses to Michigan, as long as they finish 10-2, they're going to have a top 15 ranking. That's important for Ohio State if they do finish 11-1 and don't even make the Big Ten championship, because you have those key wins. You need Notre Dame to beat Clemson next week. That is so key. You need Notre Dame to win out. That's a top 15 win on your resume. You have to keep it because it is non-conference. And also, you look at the rest of the Big Ten, it is a bad conference. There is no other team inside of the analytical top 28. You can see Wisconsin at 29. If you're Ohio State, you just beat Wisconsin. You would love for Wisconsin to win out from here because that becomes a quality win. I don't think Wisconsin is going to do that, but it is very important. You look at this Ohio State team. team. Let's be honest, they're probably not going to beat Michigan. They just don't have the good quarterback play right now. Certainly it's possible it's a rivalry. We saw Michigan underdogs the last 2 years against Ohio State win outright, but it is going to be tough. So right now, if you are Ohio State, certainly when Michigan faces Penn State, you're rooting for Penn State 100% of the time, because then even if you lose to Michigan, you've got a three-way tie, and at that point it would very likely come down to Ohio State versus Penn State on who goes to the Big Ten championship in an event of a three-way round-robin tie. Everyone else in this conference is completely irrelevant when it comes to the playoff picture. Moving on to the Pac-12, I was going to say it's really Oregon and no one else. I'm just really down on Washington. Washington has had multiple games now. They cannot run the ball. They really don't have an elite defense. Honestly, they don't even have a good defense at this point. You're allowing 33 points to Stanford. It's not ideal. So Oregon, they do have that one loss, but Washington, they're hanging on by a thread. I do think Washington, obviously, considering they are 8-0, they're in a better spot right now than Oregon. They did beat Oregon. It was at home, and they were outgained by 170 yards. But we are seeing the Pac-12 conference at this point really come down to earth because of USC. USC at the beginning of the year, we thought they were going to be a potential playoff team with Caleb Williams returning, the Heisman Trophy winner. The defense has been so bad at this point, USC is a fringe top 25 team. Oregon State loses. They're going to be bumped down a little bit. UCLA is trending up. Utah is trending down. Arizona is trending up. But this is really going to come down to Oregon against Washington. And I'll say this, if Oregon, let's say Washington is undefeated going to the Pac-12 championship game against Oregon with one loss and Oregon wins, Washington is out. This conference is not getting two teams in the playoff. Washington at that point would be gone. They have a really weak non-conference schedule. I think their toughest non-conference game was against Michigan State. That's going to hurt them. So Washington, the style points have just not been there. The running game is completely non-existent. The defense isn't as good as I thought it was. And if Oregon beats Washington, I think Oregon for sure goes to the playoff. Washington is done. If Washington beats Oregon, obviously Oregon would have two losses. Washington would go to the playoffs as an undefeated team. But right now, I do expect Oregon to beat Washington. Washington might lose a game towards the end of the regular season, and it will be Oregon, at least at this point, I'm looking from the Pac-12 to make the playoff. Moving on to the SEC, you are looking right now, it's Alabama and Georgia, both of those teams sitting with 1-0 losses. Ole Miss has one loss, but they do not have the tiebreaker against Alabama, meaning Alabama can lose and still go to the SEC championship because they have the head-to-head win over Ole Miss. I still think Ole Miss is going to lose another game, but they're starting to get into the picture here with only one loss. We will see. You do have Missouri sitting with one loss as well, but they have a road game at Georgia. You really want to throw, some chaos into it. Imagine Missouri beats Georgia. Very unlikely considering how Georgia's played the last few weeks. They've been a lot better, but either way, it's looking like it's going to come down to, once again, Alabama and Georgia. And the last thing anyone wants is the death note, which would be a one-loss Alabama beating an undefeated Georgia. Do we have to deal with two SEC teams in the playoff again? I think this is the other issue that we have to deal with. Let's say LSU wins out, so Bama would be gone because they would have two losses. They wouldn't even go to the SEC championship because LSU would have the head-to-head. But the problem is LSU would be 10-2. Let's say LSU beats Georgia in the SEC championship. Then you've got a two-loss LSU team very likely in the playoff. Georgia would probably be in the playoff as well. I don't think that's going to happen because LSU has a terrible defense, but that is a scenario. I think when it comes to this Alabama-LSU game, you are for sure rooting for LSU to beat Bama because then Bama's done with the two losses unless something, I still think Alabama's probably done. Something would have to happen to where LSU would have to lose to someone else. Then Bama would go to the SEC championship with two losses. And then what if Bama wins the SEC championship against Georgia? Would they get in with two losses? There's a lot of scenarios, but I think what the hope is, if you're guarding against two SEC teams making it, you just want Georgia to win out. I mean, Georgia's going to make it. It is what it is, but it's kind of like last year. Cut your losses, let Georgia win out. The last thing anyone needs is the SEC to infest the college football playoff again with two teams in it. So I would say at this point, Georgia very likely. Bama, What if Georgia loses to Missouri? Maybe that is possible. It'd be crazy, but again, it's very unlikely. And then moving on to the group of 5, very impressed with SMU. SMU right now analytically is the best group of 5 team, but they do have 2 losses. You can see they're ranked 19th right now. Now, if you're a casual person, you would think, oh my goodness, Tulane, they're ranked inside of the AP top 25. Guys, it doesn't work that way. SMU is far better than Tulane. They've got a much higher offensive upside, and also they've got a really underrated defense, and right now they've got around a 50% chance to win out. Very likely going to be finishing 10-2 and an outside shot at going to a New Year's Six Bowl, but you do have Air Force still sitting there 8-0. And how about Fresno State? Even after their loss, they're quietly still 7-1. You can see Air Force around a 22% chance to win out. They do have a Week 13 game where they're very likely going to be 11-0 on the road at Boise State. And you might be saying, Boise State, they're 4-4. Air Force is going to win that game. That is going to be a toss-up game. Boise State is going to be up for that game. End of the regular season. Air Force has really got to be wary of that. And then you would have, on top of that, the Mountain West Championship. I think it's going to be very hard for Air Force to win out. If they don't win out, I really hope, and this is nothing against Tulane, but Tulane had their shot last year. Let's let SMU face one of the big dogs. Their offensive firepower, the SMU defense, I would be very disappointed if they chose Tulane over SMU. I guess that's going to work itself out, though, because maybe they would face in the American Championship. Yeah, that would work itself out no matter what. If SMU beats Tulane, they would go. If Tulane beats SMU, yeah, that makes sense. So I would expect right now it to come down between Air Force and SMU, with Tulane sitting in the back waiting. Also, you could say maybe Memphis has an outside shot because they get SMU at home later in the season. And then also the other team that would possibly be involved in this would be Fresno State. If Air Force slips up and then Fresno State wins the Mountain West with only 1 loss, and let's say, because imagine SMU wins out, Tulane is gone because they have 2 losses and SMU has the head-to-head, but then Fresno State wins out and they only have 1 loss. I would definitely take SMU over Fresno State, but maybe because Fresno State has the 1 loss, they would end up going. But either way, right now, when it comes to the conferences, you are looking at the SEC possibly developing a narrative to have 2 teams in. It is looking unlikely, but it is possible. The problem for the SEC is Alabama is not nearly as good as they normally are. So it wouldn't surprise me if Alabama lost to LSU or even another team. And then very likely Alabama's going to lose to Georgia no matter what. So I think, you do have Ole Miss standing there with 1 loss. I'm guessing they're going to lose another game. Either way, we will see. The Pac-12, to me, it is probably going to be Oregon or bust. Now, Oregon or Washington, I should say. If Washington wins out, they're in. Obviously, they're undefeated. But if Washington loses to Oregon in the Pac-12 championship, they're not in. I'm sorry. They've shown too many flaws. They had a horrible non-conference schedule. And that bad non-conference schedule, it's going to get penalized at the end of the year if you do lose to Oregon and you're not a conference champion and your best non-conference win was against Michigan State. Now, when you look at the Big Ten, you do have this, again, a similar scenario. The other issue, this would be an issue for Michigan. If Ohio State does beat Michigan, let's say Michigan beats Penn State, Ohio State beats Michigan. Michigan is sitting there with 1 loss. They're probably going to have amazing analytics, but they had a horrible schedule. Michigan does not have a top 25 win right now. They're going to have, if they beat Penn State and lose to Ohio State, 1 top 25 win. I think they're probably out because of their horrible non-conference schedule. Now, it doesn't matter if Michigan beats Ohio State, they're completely fine, but that's the issue. When you have such a bad non-conference schedule, you have 0 margin for error, because if Michigan loses to honestly either Penn State or Ohio State, they're completely screwed, because if it is a 3-way tiebreaker, Michigan is out because they've got no chance in terms of the teams that they faced from the Big Ten West. It comes down to a record comparison. It would really come down to Ohio State and Penn State in the event that ended up happening. And then you're looking at the Big 12. It's Oklahoma or Texas. I think Texas probably wins out. They get in. I still have my questions about Texas, but I also think the Big 12 could be done completely if both of those teams, obviously if they both lose another game, they're going to be done. And then when it comes to the ACC, it's Florida State or bust. The only thing that's kind of interesting, what if Louisville wins out? They've only got a 5% chance, and that's not even counting the potential ACC championship game. I think Louisville is definitely not winning out. It comes down to Florida State, and the idea would be if Florida State finishes 12-0 but loses in the ACC championship, so they'd be 12-1, where does that put them in relation, possibly, what happens with LSU? That's their big non-conference win. I think Florida State's out if that happens, honestly. I think they have to win the ACC, but we will see. Either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.